For those of us who work in the health sector, the budget is always a source of anxiety because one never knows whether the health budget has lived up to its expectations or responsibilities. And in fact, for decades has either stagnated or declined, much to our consternation. During the pandemic, there was some, growing realization that we really need a robust and resilient healthcare system. But does that really translate into how the budget is structured and funded? And given the growing health needs in the country and also the health inequities, there is greater and greater need for us to unpack the budget and really take a look at how it's addressing those needs. Of course, more than anything, we're concerned about how women's needs are being addressed. Their constraints and barriers that they face in accessing healthcare are well known, and so the question again arises as to how is that issue being addressed by the health budget. Today, to unpack some of these issues, we have Professor Ritu Dewan, and she, of course, requires no introduction. She's the Vice President of the Indian Society of Labor Economics, Vice President of the Indian Society of Agricultural Economics, visiting professor at the Institute of Human Development, co-founder of the Feminist Policy Collective, trustee of the Center for Budget and Governance Accountability, trustee of the India Forum, director of the Leaflet, president of the Indian Association for Women's Studies from 2014 to 2017. And she was the first ever woman director of the Department of Economics, University of Mumbai, and the founder member of the first Center of Gender Economics in Asia. She has over 150 publications, including 45 books and monographs, encompassing a wide range of issues, including development economics, gender studies and gender economics, rural and urban development, infrastructure, labor markets, environmental displacement, peace studies, etc. She was a member of the Feminist Economists Group for engendering the 12th and 11th five-year plans, as well as the subgroup on gender and macro policies appointed by the Planning Commission, Government of India. She's also consultant to UNDP, UN Women, ILO, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, World Wildlife Fund, ActionAid, and so on. She's closely associated with training and capacity building related especially to gender budgeting and gender issues, and has conducted over 300 workshops for the central government and also several state governments, including Jammu and Kashmir, Maharashtra, Goa, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, etc. Her research focus, which interlinks academics, advocacy, and action, is the result of issues related to the marginalized. The last three publications focusing on theoretical, empirical analysis of paid, unpaid work, titled Invisible Work, Invisible Workers, the Sub-Economies of Paid and Unpaid Work, Demonetization from Deprivation to Destitution, and Pandemic, Patriarchy and Precarity, Labor, Livelihood, and Mobility Rights. Today, Professor Dewan is going to be talking about gender equity in the 2023 Union Budget, focus on development and health. Thank you, Ritu, for being with us today. We look forward to your talk. Just a couple of housekeeping issues. One is that we request everyone to put your questions in the Q&A box, please, and they will be taken up at the end of the talk. And also the talk will be is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel for those of you who would like to watch it again later. Over to you, Ritu.
Thank you so much, Professor Seshadri, for this introduction, and also, of course, PHFI for inviting me for this monthly colloquium. The issue which you all have chosen really, I think, resonates with the kind of work which you do. So the linkage for me is very, very, fascinating fascinating, particularly in relation to the entire developmental and economic contextualization. Because when we talk about the budget, it's not in isolation. And I think you put it very well, that every budget, in your introduction, that every budget leads to a lot of anxiety. And somehow that anxiety we thought, would reduce, particularly after learning from the lessons of the pandemic, not so much the pandemic itself, but as the policy response to the pandemic, which we all know was extremely problematic. And therefore, a whole lot of hopes which are belied, etc. So this contextualization, I think, has to be seen in the broader context. It's health, it's equity, it's gender. And when I say gender, it's of course men and women both. And also transgenders. That's a sector which we don't really talk about or even recognize, academically, even forget about in policy. And within the entire context of development, the paradigm of development which is taking place. So what I have tried to do in this presentation, of course, I have a PPT because there's a lot of data which is there, but I will not be reading out from the PPT. I think that's the most killing thing, really, which one can do. So I'll just share this, and then we can take it on from there. Now, what I have focused on in particular, one second, I'll just go, is the broader context of, like I said, development. And health is also, for me, partly related to the health of the economy. So it's the question not only of equity in gender, but equity in development and very much equity in health. Now, this was, of course, a very problematic issue in the sense that there's so much to it that I think on each aspect we can have a 4-day, 10-hour-a-day seminar. So what I have done is try and contextualize the issues which are there, identify some of them, and then take snapshots of different components. I mean, I can't take everything on gender equity. I can't take everything on health because it's really, there's so much to understand and so much to analyze within that. But snapshots which give the entire perspective of the context of the Union Budget 2023. And we were hoping, of course, that this is the last budget before the next elections, and it would take some of these issues into account. But, well, I'm saying it at the outset that it is, and there are many problems where this is concerned. Now, I have broken up this presentation into 5 components. Of course, the contextualization, which is extremely important. Certain aspects of the budget, demystifying some of these issues, which are extremely important. Some gender issues, health, and also, now remember, it's not only health. Since I think 2021, the concept of health, the allocations of health have included what is called well-being. And I put this well-being into quotes because it doesn't fit into the issue of health at all. And that is sanitation and water. That those allocations have also been included in the entire context of health. And of course, I really didn't know how to conclude. So I said in lieu of a conclusion. So maybe it's not a summary in that sense, but identifying very important issues which were raised before the pandemic, which were raised during the pandemic, and also very much after the pandemic. The contextualization, as I see it, is over a period of several years, and where the economy has been impacted very severely by several shocks. And a lot of these shocks are outside the budget. And this is, I think, something which it's the citizens of the country, particularly the working poor, have still not recovered from. The 2016 demonetization, there's a bit of work on this. And of course, your RBI reports, which said that demonetization did not really resolve any problem of the identified issues in terms of, taking out the black money, etc., or cashlessness. And therefore, now the cash in the economy is much higher, in fact, than what it was even before demonetization. The pain that it caused to people, particularly daily wage laborers, is something extremely problematic. Problematic is a very polite word which is there. And somehow this issue of demonetization got linked up with the implementation of the GST. Now, the definition of GST, of course, is one tax, but there have been a series of tax slabs, what we call. I think it started with 27. Now they are 4. But the problem is that the entire process set a large number of small businesses out into the loop in terms of that many of them collapsed. So also the financial crisis of 2018, digitization. And digitization, I think as a concept is absolutely acceptable. There's no problem with that. But there are two issues where India is concerned. One, that it is forced. And here I just want to give the example of what happened, what the policy change which has come from about, I think 3 days ago, and that is Narega workers are now expected. Narega, the poorest of the poor, physical workers who join this work or demand this work only because there's nothing else available, that they have been asked to download a particular app and to write their demand, their status, how much work they want, etc., etc. And unless they fill in all these forms on their phones, which of course a majority of them do not have smartphones or even phones in that sense of the term, that it's only then they will get whatever little wages have been promised to them. There are several other issues which are outside a budget, but which have impacted the issues which the economy is facing today. You have your labor laws, where a large number of women have been left out of the definition of workers. The labor laws is like labor codes which are there. All the labor laws have been replaced and labor codes are in place, which have changed even the definition of worker, saying somebody who works within the private household is not to be defined as a worker or that as a workplace. So your Sumangali workers, domestic workers, apprentices, all of them are out of the concept of a worker. There are also, of course, the Farm Acts, on which we know there's been a lot of debate and you're familiar. So a series of economic shocks and what it led to, and of course, culminated in the sense combined with over this period of 4 or 5 years is what happened during the pandemic. Now, when the pandemic came, I'm not going to the details of it, but just a few issues to flag, because they are the issues which all the budgets and every economic policy should have addressed, and which it is not addressing even today, after 3 years or 4 years. One, of course, is the slowdown, the impact on GDP before the pandemic, and which had already been collapsing at quite a low level, which had come down to about 4 or 5%. Also, all industries, manufacturing industries, where there's a lot of hope that jobs will be created, but where the reality is extremely different, we're working at 40% capacity. Because please remember, any kind of a production system can only improve and only sustain itself if there is what we call a consistent demand. And that demand, because of the collapse of incomes and wages, particularly with demonetization and of course MSMEs, actually decrease over a period of time. Also, before the pandemic, already the NFHS has showed us that 76% of the rural population could not afford a nutritious diet. Collapsing work participation rates of men and particularly of women, so much so that we have the lowest work participation rates. Earlier, it used to be only in South Asia, but now it is in all of Asia. In fact, even lower than Afghanistan. I was really quite shocked when I read that report. And for the first time in 42 years, an increase, and this is before the pandemic, an increase in the percentage of population below the poverty line. Poverty line, of course, as you know, is pathetic, 27 rupees a day, etc. And the numbers will, of course, increase as the population of the poor increases. But the percentage increase was something which was very, very problematic, and something which a lot of economists and others have also been debating over a period of time. And then comes the pandemic, where every of these issues is exacerbated and intensified and reinforced. Every single component of these, I'm not getting to them in detail, but you know, the response to the pandemic, which of course came 3 months too late from when it was talked about in December 2019, came in the form of the most brutal lockdown in the history of the world. I mean, it's been talked about, it's been written intensively about, And to close an entire nation of migrants, particularly where 1/3 are migrants, within 4 hours, some of this 4 hours seems to be, I don't know what to use. Demonetization was 4 hours, the lockdown was 4 hours. And I think what the migrants faced, and particularly what the women faced during this period of time, visually, I don't think we can ever recover or erase that from our conscience of what was done. So therefore, what did we expect the budgets to do? And particularly this budget, because there's a huge amount of reports which have come out, national reports, even government reports which have come out, RBI, SBI in particular, of course, have brought out these, a collapse of growth. And in the pandemic, it was estimated that 27%, those are the official figures, that the GDP declined or the growth rate declined by 27%. But if you take the informal sector into account, which is more than 90% of India's workers where they are employed, it came down actually to about 50% is where the growth rate collapsed. Sectoral collapse, unemployment, work participation, particularly for women, the female work participation rates, wages, and here I'm not even talking about inflation issues, which if you combine them, the fall is even worse. MSMEs, 72% of MSMEs, and 72% of those owned and controlled by women. For men also, it was bad enough. It was about 60%, but for women, much, much more, almost 3/4 of the MSMEs. And of course, we have our inequality reports. And at an overall level, we have been very sad to say falling at every single global index. I'm not listing them out. There's some 32 indices where we have collapsed on in terms of children's nourishment, in terms of gender wage gap, environment. I'm not even getting into other issues of redefining our economy as a flawed economy or whatever. Those are different kinds of issues we can debate at a different point of time. The budget as a snapshot, there was, of course, and like I said, here the data which I'm talking about is the nominal amount, not taking inflation into account. If you take inflation, which has been the highest in, I think, 14 or 15 years, that actually the real number would go down very, very dramatically. And there was, of course, the budget that, yes, the capital expenditures increased so much from 7.5 lakh crores to 10. Now, which is a huge increase. But once we demystify this and break it up, we realize that 1/3 of this capital expenditure is by borrowing, and it will go away in interest payments over the financial year. So what it does to the fiscal deficit is another issue. So whatever we have, where is it to be invested? And it's going to be invested in sectors, and this is very clearly laid out in the budget, which are non-labor intensive. So the issue, whether it's highways, which the majority of the population does not use, they use village roads and slum roads, etc., etc. Of course, these are important. I'm not saying these are important, but where is the priority of investment, particularly in the context of very, very low employment levels and collapsing employment structures? There are, of course, at a broader level, we have seen that there's a centralization of capital, there's a centralization of power, and this is manifested in the centralization of tax revenue. Now, this is in the Constitution of India, that the tax which is to be collected, that a large proportion, and these percentages are laid down in the Constitution of India, that they should be shared with the states. Now, this is a problem, and this, when it started in 1415, tax revenue, which had to be shared with the states, the center's share, which had to be shared by the states, was almost 90%. Okay, in fact, a little more than 90%. And this has come down very sharply. That is 17.5, 17.6% or whatever it is not going to be distributed. And what really does this mean? It means that there is less with the states, not only to invest in health and several other issues, but also for long-term development needs, which a particular state or different states might need. The issue of subsidies, of course, there has been, debate on whether subsidies should be allowed, they should not be allowed, are they good for the economy, are they just freebies which are to be given? But if you see the nature of subsidies, that the people of India, the majority of India's people cannot survive unless these kinds of subsidies are given. I'll go into some of these components at a later stage as and when. And what you have now is a reduction in subsidies over almost by half, from 7.6 lakh crores to 4 lakh crores. So that 5% decrease in the fiscal deficit is coming through the reduction in subsidies. The issue of revenues I will talk about later, but the main social sectors, and 16, those are the 16 main social sectors: environment, climate change, health, family welfare, I mean, you name it, social welfare, tribal amount, minority affairs, rural development, all these aspects, every single sector of these 16 sectors, the allocations have actually been reduced, so much so that overall subsidies have come down from, which were in 2021, were 1/3 have come down to almost a quarter in this budget. This is something which is not really expected, keeping all the other issues in mind. Among the most shocking was the reduction in Narega. And this is important because we saw, even in demonetization and of course during the pandemic, that there was a huge movement of workers because nothing was available in the urban areas. Everything was closed down, from the rural to from the urban to the rural areas, what we call reverse migration. And the only succor, the only recourse which the returning migrants had, and even today a large number have. And why I'm saying Narega is extremely important, because I remember when we were discussing Narega with the Planning Commission and the Ministry of Rural Development, etc., that why don't we have a 30% reservation for women? And in a way, I'm so glad that it didn't work out, the 30% reservation, because in fact about 58% of Narega workers are women, because it's really work of a last resort in that sense. And this was very shocking, that the only recourse to rural people and also to the migrants, returning migrants in particular, primarily women, is that Narega saw a reduction or a cut by 33% in this, even though the budget estimates, the revised estimates were higher. And several studies have come out that in the last year, the last 2 years before the pandemic. Now, what Narega says, again, according to the law, it's put into the constitution, is that every worker who demands, it's a demand-driven scheme, and every worker should get 100 days of work, but the average which has got is about 25 days of work in the year. Wages given is, of course, another huge issue for discussion, delayed wages, etc., etc. Midday meals. Now, this was shocking again, because the percentage of undernourished children, or wasted and stunted children in our country has gone up. Not only the numbers, but the percentage. And nutrition has been reduced like Narega. Nutrition, the food which is to be given, or the subsidies which have to be given to food, reduced by 32%. This was something which we, I remember when I was going through the budget documents, I read them again and again, that have I mistaken what has been done in this particular budget. The issues, of course, of, so this is an overall, of course, in certain details, one can go into the detailed analysis during discussion, but it was very difficult to take much more in this particular context, because I wanted to focus partly on gender and partly on the health issues. Gender issues, again, in a way, a snapshot, but what I think is the most important issues which are there is there is what we started in when we were part of the 10th plan and 11th plan, etc., in the Planning Commission. We started the process in 2009, I think it was 8-9, that part of the budget should be allocated to women, what is called a gender budget. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the context of a gender budget. I'll explain it in a bit, that this has gone up in numbers where the ministry is concerned. Ministry of Women and Child Development. Now, that's another issue which I have been talking about and writing about and arguing about, but that why does it have to be Ministry of Women and Child? It should be a separate Ministry of Children and a separate Ministry of Women. Because really what tends to happen is a huge amount of allocation to the Ministry of Women and Child goes to children, and which is very important. I'm not denying that at all. But having a Ministry of Women and Child, it reinforces the gender divide which exists within a society, that it's women who are responsible for children and not families or parents, etc., etc. The role of the state, of course, is something which we can always debate upon. Now, the gender budget as a percentage of the total budget has never been more than 1% historically. The highest which we achieved was the 11th plan and the 12th plan, where we managed to get about 0.98% of the total budget. But this now has been showing a consistent fall from 0.72 to 0.71, etc., etc. Now, a gender budget, or what is to be spent on women, is broken up into two components. One is called the Part A and one is called the Part B. Part A, and that's 100%, is that all the schemes and all the money should go only to women. That is what we call women-specific schemes. Now, this has increased by 70% ostensibly, okay? But that is what we call the budget estimate compared to the budget estimate. But if you see the revised estimate of last year, it was much higher. So what has been taken, what was there last year was over 90. That is a revised estimate because there was more need. But that greater need during the last financial year was not taken into account, and it was increased only by 88 or a few thousand crores. So there's actually a fall of about 3%. Now, another problem with this, because if Part A says that these are women-specific schemes where all the beneficiaries must be women, this amount in this budget includes the Awas Yojana, that is the housing scheme. And nowhere does the housing scheme say that the ownership of the house, which is to be built under the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, shall be in the name of only women. So therefore, this 38% of 54,000, 55,000 crores, which are there, it should not be in Part 1 at all. It should be in Part 2 or in some other kind of allocation, and outside gender or even within the broader conceptualization. What is very worrying is the Part B. And this why? Because it says that all schemes, every scheme should have 30% beneficiaries and allocation to women. And this allocation has actually been falling, or the percentage amount which is given to the Part B schemes has fallen to 61% only. And what this implies in a longer, larger context is not only dilution and prioritization, but a dilution or a negation of the very concept of mainstreaming. Because why we got Part B when we started the gender budget statement in the Planning Commission was to mainstream, whether it's in industry or manufacturing or railways or everywhere possible, 30% should be for women. But this is now fallen down, diluted, negated, and the whole concept of mainstreaming and empowerment, empowerment is a very vague kind of a term in many ways, has been, it's really now seen as a very reductionist kind of a priority where the union budget is concerned. There was, and this is something which of course we had been asking for quite some period of time, and that is an urban employment scheme. And after the pandemic, particularly what women migrants went through, there is what is called the Deen Dayal Antyodaya Yojana. That is the National Urban Livelihoods Mission, which was given in 2 budgets ago, 450 crores. In that budget, the last budget, it was reduced. Already the revised estimate was almost half, and now it does not find any mention at all where this is concerned. So with the collapse in work participation rates, particularly of women, in both rural and also very much in urban areas. Now there is absolutely no scheme in which you can fall back upon or just hope. The amount is very minuscule, of course, but even so, it was something at least which was there. And one could always bargain and say that, please give us some more, etc., etc. The 2 or 3 aspects I would like to focus on, because we really, don't take these into account. Transgender persons. And it's only the 2011 census which has calculated transgender persons, and it comes into a few lakhs, but which every state government, particularly Karnataka, I think, did an amazing survey of transgenders and actually pointed out formally, including in the assembly, that there's been a huge undercounting of transgender persons in terms of the percentage of population as in terms of numbers. Now, transgenders do not have any kind of a separate scheme. There is a scheme, and these acronyms are very cynical. It's called SMILE, all right? Support for marginalized individuals for livelihood and enterprise. And to this has been allocated 6 crores. I mean, the number of transgenders, the kind of violation which they face, a huge number of them, in fact, almost all of them, were thrown out during the pandemic, apart from other workers, and the kind of exploitation they face at particular levels. To allocate them only 6 crores is I think, unforgivable. There's no other word for this. And they do not exist in any other scheme. No scheme is transgender person really pointed out. And some of us who've done field work during the pandemic, and surveys which were carried out showed very clearly that transgender persons were the most and the worst affected. I'll just give you 2 examples. Of course, society's attitude to transgenders, etc., etc. Also remember that during this period was what was called social distancing. But I don't like to use the term social distancing. It's physical distancing. We're already socially distanced in terms of gender, in terms of caste, in terms of caste, class, minorities, etc., etc. And this kind of a physical contact or non-physical contact possible during the pandemic impacted transgenders the worst, because a significant, I won't say all, I mean, that's totally wrong, but a significant proportion of them were involved in commercial sex work. And I've interviewed, and the most painful interviews which I have done during the pandemic is when these transgender persons were charging 7 rupees an encounter. That is the desperation level to which they had come. The attitude to transgenders, even during the pandemic, many of us, of course, we set up a migrant camps, and I'm sure many, many of you have been involved in supporting migrants during that crazy, that lockdown which was there. And, we're raising, whether it's khichdi or wheat or whatever, we're trying to raise everything possible in terms of food, transport, clothing, accommodation, etc., etc. And I got a call from one of the largest social service trusts, okay? And I don't want to name it, but it runs a significant amount of midday meals, etc. It's a private trust. And they suddenly rang me up, and said that we have 7 kilos of khichdi, and we want to distribute it before it gets spoiled. We have only 3 hours. So please find somebody. So I rushed around, etc., etc., found this one community, one section in a slum, which had not eaten for 2 days. And I sent them the address, and they called me back in the evening, and they said, "Where did you send us?" I said, "Where? These are the people who had not eaten for 2 days." They said, "No, but they are the Kinnar community, and our religion does not allow food to be distributed to the transgenders." Kinnars, as you know, are a transgender community. So in keeping with all this, which a lot has been written about, 6 crores is like a total insult to the entire community. The issue of gender-based violence, and why I'm focusing on this, because what really we have over the past few years, we know that there has been a huge increase in gender-based violence. There's a normalization, there's an actualization of violence, and particularly during the pandemic, surveys were carried out, and in several states, the number of reported cases, and this is only reported, so you can imagine what unreported would be like, had gone up by 170%. That is the kind of gender-based violence, whether it's the public sphere or in the private sphere. But what has the response been over the past few years, not only post-pandemic, is what I call a municipality response. You know, you put CCTV cameras and you put lights, and violence against women is going to go away. In this budget, we have what is called, of course, we know the Nirbhaya Fund, which exists. Very sad to say that 75% during the pandemic, 2 years of the pandemic, had not been utilized. It had not, CAG has reported this, that is central, the Auditor General. It was not spent when there was such desperate need to reduce violence. And even this amount, of course, it has increased, which is very, very welcome. It was a pathetic 165 crores. It has gone up hugely. Though I think if you see 1,300 crores is really nothing to deal with urban, this is Safe City project, to deal with urban based gender violence. I mean, a film, the last film has earned more than this amount of money within a month. And this money has been taken away from Ministry of Urban Affairs, from the Ministry of Women and Child, and it has been shifted to the Ministry of Home Affairs. And this is something where we know is not going to resolve the issue where gender-based violence is concerned. Another aspect which I think does not get talked about, and that is person with disabilities. And India, we know, is, and this is the figure which I'm quoting, is the 2011 census, where almost 27 million people in the country, and of them, 68% are women. Okay, and this is 10 years ago or 12 years ago. Of course, there's no announcement of the census yet. And for them, a very minuscule amount of 240 crores was allocated. Now it has been reduced almost half to barely 150 crores. So, you know, when you do budget analysis, divide 150 crores by 26.8 million, and you'll see the allocation per disabled person. And this is where the number of course, the number, because the population is high, is the number of blind in the world is the maximum in India. Ministry of Minority Affairs, now this I need not explain, faced a huge cut of 38%, and it's not being compensated for by any other. There are also things which are done outside the budget, like I said. So just 2 days before the budget comes the withdrawal of scholarships. The Maulana Azad scholarships have been totally disbanded by minority students. And I think if you see this, you see the whole hijab controversy, there is a certain kind of a internal logic to where particularly minority women and of course scheduled caste and scheduled tribe women are concerned, what we call issues of intersectionality within the gender aspect which is there. Coming, I hope I have another 10 minutes at least.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, the issue of health and well-being, and of course well-being I will always put in quotes because of the change definition which is there. Now, health, as we all know, is a state subject. The ideal, and that is our seminal policy, that is the national health policy, says at least 2.5. The ideal would be 6% of the GDP, which many countries are implementing. Bangladesh in particular is a very interesting kind of an example. Not ideal implementation, not that implementation component, but at least that much amount is allocated, because we're talking on the context of the budget. Now, of this 2.5%, it is said in the national health policy that 40% has to, of the health issue, of the health expenditure allocations have to be borne by the center, and the remaining 60% by the state. So therefore, what this health budget should have done is it should have been what, I don't know how many thousands and lakhs, 6,80,000 crores is what should have been. And the center's share should have been 40% of that. But what has been allocated even less than the center's share. It's less than half, or it's about half of what the total, what the center's share should have been. So the deficit is huge. It's really massive. And we thought, that learning lessons from the pandemic and what it had done, that they would be, like what Professor Seshadri was saying, the anticipation and, the kind of tension which one faces when the budgets are coming out. But this was something which is really quite shocking. And I'm not even getting into the issues of Anganwadi workers and ASHA workers and nurses and how much they did, and they should have been compensated in particular specific kinds of ways, really to honor them. The general health budget, and why I've taken this breakup, it's very interesting, is that per person, it works out to 2,500 per capita. Okay. For central government employees, it is 14,000 per capita. Okay. Now, when we say central government employees, it's not ordinary workers or employees or in the offices. That is one component. But this includes MPs, it includes MLAs, it includes the IAS officers, it includes the IFS, the Indian Revenue Service, you name it. Every bureaucrat, every minister, every MP, every MLA is assured. Now, for people like this who we know have more than enough to spend on their own, 14,000 is really nothing. So even within this meager amount, you have the general citizens getting a very minuscule amount of what has been allocated. The core health mission, which for us was extremely important, the National Health Mission, reduction instead of an increase. The Ayushman Bharat, which was announced several time back, and this is a public health system, please remember that this has been combined with the PM Ayushman Bharat Health Infrastructure Mission, okay, where the amount has been raised by a little bit. But this allocation is not only to public health. It also includes the kind of infrastructure which is to be built for specialty hospitals, which we know to boost medical tourism, etc., etc. What we were very surprised at was the increase in allocation to the what we call the PMJAY, that is the Jan Arogya Yojana. Now, a lot of research has been done on this, and it's an insurance scheme. And the PMJAY, like I said, there's a lot of work done even by IRDAI, and where they have shown that this is actually a failed scheme, that it does not benefit the common citizen or those who need healthcare, health insurance in particular. And the calculation which has been made is that 3/4 of this expenditure goes to the private insurance sector. So one of the greatest reasons for people, for families falling into poverty is that of health and health expenditure. One small health issue can really pull you down by several deciles where the poorest or the income levels are concerned. So this was something which we found very, I don't want to keep using the word problematic, but not ethical is really the term which I would like to use. But it also gels, this context, PMJAY in particular, it gels with the broader issue of privatization and monetization, which is taking place in the country. A few years ago, and we were very happy when this was announced, health and wellness centers, whatever well-being, etc., health and wellness centers. But now they do not find a single mention in the entire budget. Allocation, of course, is virtually zero, but there is nothing which is said. Now, in conclusion, I would like to, in health, there's very much more. And I would like to put one issue forward very strongly before I come into a sort of not a summary, but an overall kind of a response to this budget. The eternal argument is not that there is not enough money with the government. And I'm just taking off from the budget. I'm not going into issues of, what assets have been sold, what has come in from monetization of public sector units, etc., etc. I'm not even getting into that. Just within the context of the budget, do we have enough money? And this is something which I think we all need to do when we do budget analysis. One, of course, is the issue of direct and indirect taxes. And I think this is very clear that we know theoretically, empirically, policy-wise, action-wise, in every single kind of a way, that it's direct taxes which are more progressive in the sense that they benefit the people more and not the indirect taxes. You know, we get this statement which I keep hearing all the time. Oh, why should the poor get subsidies? They don't pay taxes. But please remember that the poor pay the majority of taxes because of the indirect taxes. It's not in the GST, but a huge number of indirect taxes which exist. The ideal should be 65%, which is what several countries, particularly the Nordic countries, have attained. That is 65% of the revenue should be direct taxes. I think the government managed to achieve 2009-10, and this was in a way learning from the economic crisis, the Lehman Brothers issue, achieved 61%, which is really something which was quite remarkable. Now, how does one get this 65%? And several of us, I belong to CBGA also, where we do this kind of work, that is Center for Budget and Governance Accountability. And it is easily attainable. All that we use, and we had said this to the last year to the finance minister, we had said it again, we had sent representations this year, we've been sending it for 2 or 3 years in particular, is that just a 1% increase for the top 7% of India's taxpayers will raise this entire funding and make the share 65%. There is also, on the other hand, a decline in the corporate income tax. The percentages are very clear, from 35 to 27. Revenue foregone, and this I'm not even calculating the 1,68,000 crores, which were, you know, where bad loans of large companies and banks was written off 2-3 years ago. That the exemptions and the expenditures given to, that is the revenue foregone, to the manufacturing companies and to the corporates of the manufacturing companies is 2.5% of the GDP. And this amount, if we add the revenue foregone and the uncollected taxes, and why I'm saying uncollected taxes, because it talks about the efficiency or the lack of efficiency of the fiscal architecture, which is 10% of the GDP, are taxes which are not collected. The data has been coming out consistently for different states as budgets are being presented. And this, just as uncollected taxes are enough for universalization for every citizen of the country, rich or poor, of healthcare, education, welfare, and social security. So to say there is no money available is just totally economically not acceptable. Now, in conclusion, I know I have gone a bit beyond time. And this I have just listed out, there were 39 which I had listed out. I've reduced them just to 10, particularly where women are concerned, and to show that the budget has not addressed anything. It has not addressed employment, that is loss of jobs, the reduction in wages, the non-payment of wages even during the pandemic or even during Narega. A huge increase in unpaid work. It's not only returning migrants or this work from home kind of an issue, but during the pandemic, 3 issues, and in the budget, Ujjwala, and I'm not talking of the out of budget increases from 500 rupees to now 1,200 rupees is a gas cylinder, at least in Maharashtra. But the withdrawal of Ujjwala, the withdrawal of DBTK, which is the direct benefit transfer to kerosene, where they're allowed to increase their money, the price of kerosene very regularly. A rise in dropout rates of boys and very much of girls. The access, now with online classes, etc., which continued. Surveys were done on how many, particularly in rural areas, girls have mobiles. Only 11% have access to mobiles in the rural areas. Decrease in nutrition, we know this went on. Midday meals cut. Child budget is the lowest in 12 years. Lowest in 12 years when it should have been the highest. Because what this does, along with closure of childcare services and fallen immunization, particularly during the pandemic, when the entire focus was on COVID, that it impacts it's a long-term health impact. It's not only, you know, within a year or so. Of course, many reports, meso reports, state level reports and micro reports on increase in infant and child mortality rates, increase in maternal mortality rates, increase in unsafe abortions, unwanted pregnancies. None of these have been addressed in the budget. And of course, the issue of gender-based violence, which we know is huge every day. It's increasing. And I think the unkindest of all was the non-recognition of the decline in age at marriage, for boys very much so. And this any national disaster analysis over decades has shown that one of the first impacts is a decline in age at marriage for boys as well as for girls. And we have seen what is happening in Assam, you know, arrest of girls who have married below the age of birthing. So overall, if you really have to say, I think what the budget has done, it has reduced the capacity or the level of health equity. It has not only not maintained it, it has actually reduced it over a period of time. And within this, to whatever level of equality women had achieved, transgenders, of course, is a different issue, that there is a process of what I call gender de-equalization via the budget, apart from outside the budget. A lot more to say, but I will stop here. Thank you so much.